Hi and welcome, everybody. Good morning. You're in the data science and education session. Just so you're aware, that's my faculty instinct to say this is the class that you're in. If this is not the right class, consider leaving. So thanks for everybody for coming. We're going to jump right into it. I'm Brian Wright. I'm assistant professor here in the new School of Data Science. I have kind of an overlap in education. I've built some data science programs at a few other places. I'll have the panel introduce themselves here in just a second. But to give some context to what we're doing here today, and I think maybe most people are aware of this or not, but as a key component of the School of Data Science, we have this natural orientation towards a school without walls, right? And so a lot about what we're doing today, and I think we talked about this, Arlen mentioned it a lot this morning, is about building relationships not just with the other academic schools, but also in a broader context, getting relationships in the broader academic domains, right? So we see ourselves as certainly building these bridges on campus, but also building like a pipeline to where the methods and the practices that we're developing in the school can impact the fields outside and surrounding the school. So what we're calling them is co-laboratories. I don't know if that is the name that we're using. And so the nature of that is this kind of joint research, curriculum, service between us and the other schools to impact these larger domains. And so the one that we're talking about today is education. So everybody here on the panel has a vested interest in this space, but the orientation of this conference is a lot about getting to kind of present what we're doing in that space, to talk about what these really smart and capable people are doing in their current work, but also to kind of elicit feedback from you guys to say, hey, these are the things that we want to see kind of in the education field, or these are issues of concern or topics we'd like to talk about in order for us to kind of paint a picture about where the school and the field of education can move together collaboratively. So that's what we want to do. So we're going to talk about, I have some questions here that the panel is going to address, but then after that, we'd really like to open it up to be kind of a dialogue back and forth, because I think you guys are going to have lots of great insights and we'd really like to benefit from that. Does that all make sense? Okay. All right. With that, let's jump right into introductions. So let's go ahead. So Catherine.
Hey, good morning, everyone. My name is Kat Finnegan. I'm the Assistant Vice Chancellor for Research and Reporting at the Virginia Community College System. I have responsibility for ensuring that the 23 community colleges, as well as the I think it's 35 American Job Center regions, provide data to the state, to the federal government, and then actually collect data to ensure that our students are being served, that our communities are being served, and that we are fulfilling our mission.
Hi, my name is Brian Kim. I am a third-year doctoral student in the Education Policy PhD program at the Curry School of Education here. So my program is very quantitative in nature, but we typically use mostly econometric methods, statistics like that. But I've been really fortunate that my advisor, Ben Castleman, as well as some of the classes that I've been taking, have allowed me to pick up a lot of different data science skills and machine learning skills to help me figure out in an interdisciplinary way sort of how we can apply these things. And I'm still learning, so very excited.
Hi, my name is Vivian Wong. I'm an associate professor in research statistics and evaluation at the Curry School of Education. So my primary methodological work until recently has been on causal inference methods and developing experimental and quasi-experimental methods for evaluating basically intervention effects in education field settings. So more recently as a field, we've been struggling with this issue of replication and the replication of effects, as well as the robustness of these effects and the external validity of these effects across sort of context settings and unit populations. So more recently, my work has sort of methodologically has extended into this area and thinking about what does replication mean in social science and education contexts, and how do we know when we've conducted a high quality replication, and how can we use data and build data infrastructures that allow for replication of work.
Great. Okay. So in the context of this too, I should have kind of laid it out. The idea behind this is to have kind of a representative of someone kind of actually using these things in practice, which is Kat, and then of course someone that's learning them, right? That's going to come out and be smarter than all the rest of us, Brian, right? And then Vivian, a researcher that's kind of using these in the day-to-day in an academic setting. So we're kind of have all points of view, and then I guess I'm kind of a blend of those. But Okay, so the first thing we're going to go right into is kind of, what research are you currently working on, and then how does kind of data science influence that research? I know we touched on that a little bit, but Vivian, why don't you start, and then we'll kind of work down.
Okay, so I come at this mostly from a perspective of a methodologist who is interested in designing evaluations for evaluating specific interventions and types of policies. So as I mentioned, replication is an issue that we are sort of beginning as a field to struggle with. And in education, we have lots of contexts where we have needs to really understand what the efficacy of different interventions are, but we struggle because, for example, in special education settings, we have very few number of students in which researchers are able to sort of be able to gather access to because maybe they might have low incidence disabilities. We also have an issue where we might not have as heterogeneous samples as we often may want to in terms of it being as representative of the populations in which we want to make generalizations about. So one idea that me and several other colleagues at the Curry School of Education, including Brian Cook and Bill Theron, who are special education researchers, has sort of come up with is thinking about building an infrastructure for basically crowdsourcing replication studies across independent but coordinated teams of researchers. So this has already been done in other disciplines, including in psychology with like the many lab studies. But there's an additional challenge in education context because instead of sort of conducting these studies in lab settings, the idea would be to crowdsource these types of studies across independent teams of researchers and have them deliver interventions as well as sort of collect data in the field. So as we've been working on this project and we've got seed funding from the Institute for Education Sciences and a couple other funding agencies, we've been thinking about the types of sort of infrastructure supports that coordinated teams of researchers need in order to be able to deliver these high quality sort of replication studies. And basically the idea here is that we in some ways want to change the paradigm of how we're currently doing research right now in education, but also I think in psychology and other social sciences. So right now we have mostly independent teams of researchers who are exploring sort of independent questions with small samples and producing lots of results. That's great for generating sort of novel types of questions and producing results, but it's terrible basically for producing replicable and robust results. So I think part of this is going to be a data infrastructure issue in which we just don't have that foundation currently, at least as I'm exposed to in education sciences. And so some of the work collaborations with Brian has been sort of learning about how to basically build sort of cloud computing sort of infrastructure that will allow us to be able to collect data across distributed networks of researchers. The other sort of aspect that we've been working on is thinking about what does it mean to have a high quality replication study and using sort of natural language processing methods, sort of different kind of data science techniques for being able to quickly process the data to be able to provide sort of feedback for us, but also for our partners who are conducting studies in the field so that we can sort of try to ensure that our studies are implemented with sort of high fidelity. So that's sort of the basic plan of what we're doing, but I will pause there and sort of let Brian and Kat describe their projects.
Great.
Yeah, great. So when I think of the work that I'm doing, two of the big ways in which I see data science and machine learning coming in. The first is the way I conceptualize it is as like data generation. So in economics, in education policy, some of the biggest advances in our quantitative ability to understand what's going on and to do causal inference has been the development of really large administrative databases in which we see everyone who's attending a given school or in a state, and we can start to actually make really strong studies about what's going on and understand what's going on under the hood, what's happening with these people. And so for me, one thing that I've thought a lot about, so I was a former high school English teacher, and one thing that I know of from the context of high school, and I think is true across many educational contexts, is that we are, in all of these systems, collecting a lot of information, but a lot of that information is stored or in formats that are not particularly conducive to our traditional quantitative analysis skills. So I think of things like, if you think about the entire college application process, there are student essays being written, letters of recommendations being written, evaluations of students being written. For something like that, where almost an unbelievable amount of data is being stored in text, we are not typically prepared to, in the education policy sphere, in the econometric sphere, analyze that data at scale. We have a lot of qualitative analyses, case studies, things like that are important and excellent. But we're talking millions of these documents, millions and millions every single year being generated. And so some of the research that I'm doing right now is working with a college application platform, trying to better understand, for example, what are the trends in the ways that teachers talk about students when they're applying to college. Another thing you can imagine also happening is when students are writing their essays, are there particular trends in the sort of things that they write about and the ways that they talk about themselves, and the bearings that might have on their application processes, in access, and so on and so forth. So one of the big opportunities that I see going forward is, you can imagine all of these different ways in which naturally, just through the course of the way that our educational systems work, we have so much information being generated, but we need to figure out ways to analyze them. I saw a really cool study that came out, I think 2 years ago now, where they took the sort of videotapes of teachers teaching, which were essentially supposed to be used for teacher evaluation, for teacher coaching, to give them feedback on their teaching practice, but they were using machine vision to help figure out okay, when a student raises their hand, how long does it take for the teacher to respond to them? Does that vary by demographics of the student, for example? And so you can imagine that, especially as teacher coaching gets more and more pervasive, teacher evaluation continues to be pervasive, that there are all of these huge databases that are being generated in which we can run analyses on them, but we aren't quite doing that yet. And as those technologies develop, there are a lot of opportunities for us to figure out really important answers to really important questions. So that's the first wing of it. The second wing of it that I think involves some of the work that we're doing with CAT and with some other higher education institutions is this idea of predictive analytics. I think there are a lot of really important ethical considerations that we will definitely touch on as we go forward in this panel, and would love to talk about that with questions from the audience. But there are a lot of ways in which we can use predictive analytics for good, thinking about what are the services that we're providing to students, what is the counterfactual of what they're currently being provided, and what are the ways in which we can improve on those services. So for example, right now, in the community college space, student dropout is very, very high, right? So I think the completion rates for 150% of expected time, the completion rates are around 20% across the country. It's very, very low. And so the question that has been, I think, on the minds of many administrators at these different institutions is how can we help students finish? Knowing that community colleges tend to be very constrained with their resources, knowing that money is really hard to come by in many places, this question of how can we better identify students who are at risk of dropping out, who we can support, and provide them with the services that they need so that they can cross that finish line. And so there are a lot of really cool projects that are happening, some of which I'm involved with and have been helping out with, that involve trying to use predictive analytics, looking at this huge administrative database of 20 years of students, seeing who dropped out at what point in their career, why, or not why, but when did that happen? What do we know about those students? And how can we use that information to better predict students in the future or current students who may also be at risk of dropping out to identify who might receive additional resources? I think in that case, think about the ethics. The big question is always, what is the counterfactual? And the counterfactual in that case, in my eyes, is basically that the traditional methods of trying to identify these students tend not to be super comprehensive, right? It might be a professor noticing a student having a hard time. It might be them going to an academic advisor on their own volition. But if we can capture more students and get eyes on more students using things like predictive analytics to better diagnose who needs help and who doesn't, especially for those students who wouldn't otherwise, of their own volition, go and ask for help, I think that's a huge value add. So thinking about the sort of situations like that, where students, where the counterfactual of what students are already doing, the services that are already being provided, can be improved upon through these predictive analytics.
Great.
So Brian covered a lot of what I would have said, but I'll actually expand that out. We know that with community college students in particular, we have a very short time to influence them. Oftentimes they're coming in 2 weeks before the semester starts. We have very little information on them as we're coming in. We don't require a transcript. We don't require anything but a placement test that they're taken over in a 3-hour period. We don't have a lot of information about our students, but we need to collect a fair amount of information to do the types of analysis that Brian was talking about in a short period. What are the pieces of information that we can collect immediately that can influence our ability to to have interventions, and which interventions are the most successful. As Brian mentioned, we have very few staff. Right now, our advisor to student ratio is 1,200 to 1. That means that there's not quite a lot of time. I think it's less than probably 3 minutes per student. When you're looking at a 2-week period, even less than that, 30 seconds. And what we're trying to do right now is to be able to use technology to the best of our ability to find the students that need our help quickly. We know that there are groups of students that are going to be successful. A student who starts from an upper class family with starting full-time, 15 credit hours, who came from a high-ranking high school is likely going to be successful. In fact, from what Brian was just describing, our overarching look is completion rate is 20%. But if you look at those students, 83% will complete within time. If you look at a student who is in a less fortunate situation, may have had an experience prior to this where they weren't successful, they're coming in with a lot of baggage, if you will. How do we address that in a very short amount of time to ensure that they can continue to build on success and eventually complete their degree? And who is supposed to be the one? Who will be the right person to work with the student? Is it an advisor? Is it a faculty member? How do we put that information into their hands in a way that they can manage it with all the other things that they're doing? As faculty members, oftentimes you're dealing with not only your creating your courses, but also dealing with situations that your students bring to you. One of the things that the community college right now is taking a hard look at are those things outside of the classroom that are impacting our students. There's quite a bit of research coming out right now in terms of the homelessness amongst our students. We see close to over half of our students have a home insecurity issue. We see food insecurity among our students. How do we identify those students? What resources do we have to bring to bear that could help them to remain in their classes, to remain successful? We've recently been able to pull together a cross-agency conversation. We're calling it the power of the possible. But one of the things that we're looking at right now is what data is coming out of the Department for Social Services, the Department of Justice, Department of Education, that can help us to identify these students up front, and then how do we put that information in the hands of advisors, in the hands of faculty, in the hands of students, so that they can become aware of the things that they need to be able to do to move forward.
Great. Yeah. I mean, it seems in listening to all of you, I mean, there's these really interesting problems about just the nature of the data science infrastructure that might be, I know you mentioned infrastructure in particular, but we think of like the natural pipeline. I mean, the pace with which you have to get these things to the students, getting the data in a place that we can use it, and then actually having the infrastructure to be able to support these things, right? So it's really, really interesting question. So, so as we kind of move forward with this, the question is, what pieces of these components do we want to see? I mean, maybe it's all of them, right? But which pieces, do we see as most critical, or how do we see the field of data science and education evolving, or how would we want it to evolve over the next 5 years to kind of confront some of these challenges and leverage these opportunities? So that's open-ended, so whoever wants to talk.
I'm going to take a stab at this question by talking a little bit about at least what I have sort of perceived has happened in the field of education in the last 20 years, and then use that to maybe extrapolate out into the next 5 years. So in education, at least in the in the work that we do in terms of thinking about evaluations of programs and policies, the field of education has recently undergone a revolution in terms of methods and incorporating new methods. So I think before 2000-ish or so, you would very rarely see randomized control trials. You would very rarely see sort of rigorous quasi-experimental or observational study designs in education fields, or in the field of education. But in the last 20 years, there's been a really concerted effort to sort of move education research, at least in terms of being able to identify sort of what works more along the lines of what you might see in medical fields, in terms of how the FDA sort of evaluates drugs and approves drugs and trials. And so that was done through a really concerted effort that was led mostly through the Institute for Education Sciences, which was established in can't remember what, 2002 or so. And that was a multi-pronged sort of effort that included support, funding of studies that included RCTs. It included a concerted effort of pre-doctoral and postdoctoral training to give people who are coming into the field, of which I was the first cohort, and Brian is currently a member of that effort, into being able to give people the tools and the language. And then sort of government regulatory agencies that sort of highlighted sort of standards, basically, of what we think of as being high quality research. So in terms of sort of thinking about moving forward, I think in terms of sort of bringing another kind of revolution of methods into the field, I will say that right now when I sit on lots of review panels that evaluate proposals sort of moving forward, that, you know, right now there's still a lot of questions. There's some sort of skepticism, I think, of how we think about how to incorporate data science into the field of education. But I think what's sort of required is to have both sort of these good case studies of how sort of data science methods can be integrated in forming sort of the work of you know, high quality of education research. But what I have also found in the last 20 years of sort of working in this area where we've been trying to move the needle in terms of methodology development is that you really sort of need people who are able to speak the language of people who are sort of in the core disciplinary education, but folks who also understand sort of data science methods. And so in this way, I think that this plan from the data science school to have these fellowships, to have this type of collaboratory is essential for this field to be able to move together, because you need to be able to have folks who are able to sort of speak the language of both disciplines and be able to sort of make those connections, I think, in terms of being able to understand where the real value added is in addressing sort of challenges that we have in the field.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a good point. Maybe a lot of it is just being able to translate each other's language, right? To be able to just socialize. What about others? You guys have about the next 5 years? Yeah.
I agree. I think one of the places that I struggle is being able to explain what the information means, and to put it in a way that for instance, an advisor who may have come out of a discipline that didn't have a data background will understand. They understand the starfish model. I saved that one, I saved that one, I saved that one. But when I want to look at it, particularly in the VCCS, one of the things that we want to do is ensure that we're hitting scale. It's great to save the individual. We want to save the individuals, but at the end of the day, to move where Virginia needs to go, where our students need to go, we need to be able to impact them more broadly. I think we're doing a better job. I'm seeing with a new crop of presidents coming in, they understand data. They're hungry for data. They're hungry for more data. But one of the places that I also see them struggling is which data is the most important? Where do I focus my efforts and where do I focus my attention? And I think a lot of what Brian's doing, a lot of what Vivian's doing will help to do that. But I think it's incumbent upon our departments of education, as they're helping to support these upcoming leaders, to actually include that as part of the work. It's not simply enough to understand the regulatory atmosphere that we're in and what's required of colleges and schools to be able to maintain what they are able to do for accreditation purposes as well as for legal purposes, but to actually be able to take that information that we're collecting, combine it with other things, focus it as a part of our strategic movement.
Great.
Yeah. So I love both of these answers, and one of the things I really like is this idea of like the language that we're using. I think it implies also the importance of having conversations about this. One of the really, consistently when I go to different research talks, one of the things that I really love hearing is the ways in which data help people have important, necessary conversations in a more informed, productive way, to structure what people understand, to share an understanding and knowledge about what's going on, and to then be able to, as a group of shared stakeholders, figure out what to do about it, right? To figure out how to use this information in a way that's going to help people move forward. And so I think this idea of helping everyone involved get a better understanding of what exactly is at stake here, but importantly, what are the shared priorities, what are the things that we actually want to do, and what are our goals here. But then importantly, having a really good ability on both sides to really understand what is happening with regards to these methods, with regards to these data collection practices. I think it's really important to think about the practitioners in the field, so whether that's administrators, advisors, professors, teachers in the K-12 context, but I think really importantly, the other stakeholders who we know need to be involved in this conversation, such as parents, such as students, community members, and thinking about how can we have, going forward, enough people in the field who can have these conversations, facilitate these conversations, and explain some of these really obtuse, difficult concepts to other stakeholders in ways that they're actually going to be able to grasp, and that they're actually going to be able to then come to the table and be part of that conversation in a way where they can represent their interests as they need to. So I think for me, a big part of it is thinking about how can we facilitate important conversations going forward, because I think the worst case scenario is that somebody comes in with like a lot of really cool methods and they're really excited to do these sorts of analyses, but it's a one-sided interaction, right? They're excited to look and learn about these things, but not necessarily excited to learn what these people care about or how this is going to impact them. So facilitating those conversations.
Yeah, that's great. I like the idea of us thinking about how we can build tangible pathways internally between Curry and obviously the School of Data Science, but also thinking that this conversation shouldn't be just between us, right? That we should open this up and create pathways for communities to engage. Because I think there's a certain amount of like awareness and momentum that are really correlates of each other. And so I think it could be an important part of this to be able to create pathways for that. We've been talking for a while, so I think I'll open it up. Do other people have thoughts in the room about either experiences that they've had outside of education or in their field of practice where they've tried to kind of evolve things to leverage these techniques more, or they have ideas, or they have questions for the panel too? We can do that. Yes, go ahead.
I just have this may be a naive question, but outside of completion rates, like what other metrics do you typically look at to determine like the success of a student? Because that's really like an end of life cycle thing, right? So what things do you look at along the course of their educational development to really figure out how well they're doing?
Okay. We're starting to look at a lot of what we're hopeful are leading indicators. Did a student complete an academic plan to start with? If they know where they're going, sometimes it's easier for them to actually get there. Did a student, we have a tool right now that we're using to help students explore more in depth a career that they're interested in. We're starting to collect more information on what their commuting patterns are, what their life patterns are. So we're starting to take that information and include it as part of our scheduling software to be able to say, okay, we need to ensure that we've got courses available at the times that students need to be able to take them in the methods that they're interested in. So those are administrative data versus a student type of data. We're looking at, there's a lot of indicators at the beginning that you can say a student who's had success in education in the past will likely be successful going forward. But then the question is, what do you do with students who have not been as successful? How do you move them forward? Meeting with an advisor sometimes is a simple way of looking. If they had that opportunity to sit down and talk, we recognize that they will likely at least persist into the second semester, if not the third or the fourth. So I think we recognize that from the federal standpoint, completion rates are what we're looking at right now. We also recognize that at least for community college students, placement into jobs is one thing that we want to be able to do. If you're a student who finished a bachelor's degree already, you need a couple of courses in data science to be able to get a job that helps to provide a family-sustaining wage. Then we've succeeded. We've provided you what you need. We're starting to collect that information to understand that's moving forward. One of the things we're working with Brian and with Ben right now is seeing what the impact of course taking has on wages, employability, time to employment, length of employment for first jobs, things like that. So again, a lot of those are still lagging indicators, but I think some of the things that we're looking at right now with that interaction, which we've seen from plenty of higher education research, will help us to determine whether or not a student's going to be successful.
Yeah, and that's really, it's a big data problem, right? I mean, we talked before, is it what, 180,000? No, wait, how many students do you have? It's 220,000.
Annually, we have 220,000 across the system.
Wow. I mean,
And that's
a lot.
credit. We've got another 60,000 in non-credit.
Yeah. Wow.
So to give another concrete example
Yeah.
of this, I think one of the early examples of how this could work was in the Chicago public school system. And you should correct me if I'm wrong. But basically, they did an analysis where they looked to see what are the correlates or what are the predictors of student dropout or failure to graduate, right? And so a couple of things that they identified, for example, absenteeism early on, in their freshman and sophomore year. And so as part, so a concrete thing that CPS basically did was they actually started doing these experiments where they would, I think they were like nudge experiments, basically, where if a student sort of started to be absent for, that put them sort of across the threshold of, what would be predicted to increase their probability of dropping out, they would sort of reach out to this family, to the student in various ways in order to be able to intervene. So that was sort of one of the early examples that I think we look to in terms of thinking about ways to sort of early detect when students might run into trouble later in their career.
Yeah.
Similarly, Purdue University did some really interesting studies that have not been replicated, unfortunately, but looked at students' interaction in online courses, and they found that if a student was within one standard deviation of the class average of interactions, so participating in discussions, turning in assignments, that sort of thing, they were likely to be okay. But if they were more than one standard deviation away from the class norm, on either side, either too much interaction or too little interaction, those students were much more likely to be dropping out or failing the class. So a lot of colleges now are looking at that interaction, that clickstream data, and starting to try and determine ways of providing that back to the faculty members so that while they're in the class, within 1 or 2 weeks, they can start saying, reach out to the student, find out what's going on, talk with an advisor. Several of our colleges have put into place communication tools that allow students to have a village around them. So I think that's going to be a set of data that we'd like to look at some point soon.
Interesting.
Great. Are there other questions? Go ahead. Yeah, sure.
Are there other models of education that could be enabled by these new techniques and having more data? Like, I don't want to say that the only other possible option would be online education because, 7 years ago that was thought to be a panacea and it caused some ruckus around here. But it hasn't turned into much since then. So are there other ways this could open up in a more creative way?
So maybe, can you provide a little bit more sort of detail in terms of models of how to educate folks, or?
There always anything. It's like one alternative could be that online what you're doing, but I don't want to get stuck on that particular alternative. There's other alternatives to Sage on the Stage, the way that we've been doing education for the past 100+ years.
Oh, so like how to reform education, like how we deliver education and pedagogy in general? Okay.
That's a big question. If you could answer that in the next 10 minutes. Maybe a simulation in AI work. That
Yeah, so that's a big question. And I'll be sort of the first to tell you, I mean, I'm a methodologist, so I tend to take a cynical view of a lot of things. And so it has been hard, I think, in terms of thinking about identifying pedagogical practices that are effective in delivering sort of better outcomes for students. And I think that one sort of positive development that has happened in the field in the last 20 years has been that people have been more willing to use sort of rigorous types of experimental approaches in terms of being able to understand what types of pedagogical practices are effective and what's less effective, right? So one of the things that we know, apart from sort of online, our is that there's been a number of studies that have been conducted in online environments, and that has yielded sort of useful data about what's effective and what's not. We have fewer studies, quite honestly, in terms of getting down to sort of understanding specific types of micro-pedagogical practices that teachers can engage with students in the classroom. So one way actually that I've been working on in terms of trying to address this question has been, I work with this colleague who is a faculty member at UVA, Julie Cohen. She's a teacher educator, and basically we do our studies in these what's called mixed reality simulation settings. So the classrooms are online, and our teacher candidates come into this online environment, and they interact with the student avatars who are actually played by an actor who is remote. And so basically the teacher candidate tries to deliver specific types of pedagogical skills in this environment. We observe this, and we sort of randomize different sort of conditions and scenarios. We also randomize different types of supports for the candidate. But the candidates are basically sort of learning these micro skills that are core essential sort of functions of teaching, like setting classroom norms, providing productive feedback in a discussion, classroom management, classroom behavior. And so we're basically using that kind of environment in order to be able to learn sort of what are the best ways to get these candidates ready to actually go into the field setting. And partly as a result of that is that because they're on this online platform, it just produces tons and tons of data for us to be able to use and to analyze. So that's been really helpful for being able to do things like assess the fidelity of these sessions, for coding of outcomes, those kinds of things. The other thing that it enables us to do is that typically these studies happen in one site with 40 participants. So what we're working on is being able to expand this to sites across the country, where instead of having 40 participants, we have 100 participants or 200 participants that to be able to sort of assess how robust these results that we're observing in our simulator are. So those are sort of micro steps. It's a long process, but that's currently the work that we're doing.
Well, and I think with the time we have remaining, I think what we might orient towards is just kind of what are the, if we had to take, if the people on here on the panel, and then if you guys respond, I'll ask you to respond to this question in particular. What one step would you recommend that we take as an evolving school to build this relationship? One, also with Curry, but also to think about the needs of the larger academic domain. I mean, some of the things that we've talked about, related to what variables do we use? Do we create artificial intelligence for everybody? Kind of this evolution. So what are those? One tangible thing that maybe we would do. Maybe we'll start down here.
Yeah.
No pressure.
I actually think starting to incorporate these conversations into your educational leadership courses. I think that's a very, to ensure that the leaders that are coming out today, the faculty members, the principals, the presidents of colleges and universities, have some understanding of the techniques that you're developing, and also that they're become aware of researchers like Brian and Vivian, so that once they move out into the practical sphere, they know that they can come back and ask the questions and be engaged, and they can know where to look for that information.
Yeah, one thing I think is going to be big in the education policy sphere right now, I feel like we're having a lot of conversations about the concept of like a researcher-practitioner partnership. And Kat and I and our lab are like a really great example of that. And I feel like in our department and at Curry more generally, we have really strong partnerships with community organizations, with school districts, with state departments, and so on and so forth. And I think as we build out this collaboration between the School of Data Science and Curry, as well as between data science and other institutions or other schools, I think that idea of really paying homage to those partnerships and really investing in those partnerships that department has or that school has with the various organizations that they work with, and figuring out how to be responsive to the needs of those partnerships, how to develop those partnerships more robustly, and to be really strategic and thoughtful about, how do we make these things work, and these new methods and these new technologies and these new thought processes work for everyone involved. Because I think that's going to be the way to tie your work to something really meaningful and to tie your work to something more with more longevity.
Great.
Well, I think, as I said before, I think you need to have platforms where people are speaking a common language, even if they're coming from different disciplines. And so this is why having a school is so useful, because a school is able to provide classes, to be able, to concrete skills so that people can have that kind of common language. But I will say that, for example, for my own work, I'm a statistician. I often work with folks who have substantive interests in education, and it is very difficult for us to be able to collaborate if I'm working with somebody who doesn't have sort of a basic foundation in, say, statistical theory. In the same way, I can sort of see that happening with folks who are sort of expanding their potential collaborations from education and sort of traditional statistical and econometrics into data science approaches. So one of the first things I did when Brian and I started working together is I said, Brian, give me a reading list of books that I can read so that I can at least I have the same a foundation. And so I think that that kind of basic foundation is needed in order for people to be able to work together, and a school is well equipped to do that.
Yeah, that's great. Those are all really good points. Does anybody have specific thoughts about that or questions?
So you mentioned like having a platform, maybe the collaboration in the new data science school as being like the platform that allows the same communication, right, for folks in different areas. You had mentioned before about like actual technology platforms that allow like the same common data sources to flow. So how do you see that integrating into exactly what you were talking about, so to kind of facilitate conversations just around a common data structure, et cetera?
Yeah, so I'll talk a little bit about this crowdsourcing project, which I think could be a really sort of nice model for this. So the idea for the crowdsourcing project is that we are working on building sort of this infrastructure that will allow for education researchers to be able to develop sort of a study protocol that they have conducted, suggest promising results, and then they want to be able to put out in the field for teams of independent researchers to basically replicate their study protocol, right? And so our hope, we're piloting that platform in a couple of areas, but our end goal is to be able to, once we've sort of figured out the kinks of this crowdsourcing platform, that different education researchers, for example, somebody who is interested in autism and neuroimaging wants to be able to take that platform and apply it and then be able to run their own study, or somebody else who is in reading literacy be able to create another vertical of that platform and be able to run their own study. And so our goal, I think, in the longer term is that once we've sort of established this foundation, that students and fellows who come through the data science institute and who are interested basically in both data science issues and education issues, that they get basically paired up with researchers who are interested in working on building a crowdsourcing platform, so that they gain some core substantive knowledge about sort of the education research that's happening by interacting more with the education researchers, but then also being able to apply some of the data science skills that folks who are trained with a traditional education background might not necessarily have. So that's like one concrete way, basically, that we're thinking about sort of bringing these two sort of groups together. I think having concrete projects is, a concrete end goal is useful for this task, so that it's not a theoretical exercise. So I don't know if you guys are thinking of other ways.
Yeah, I think this is something that Kat had mentioned a couple minutes ago too. I think it'll be interesting to see how we can build these platforms into curricula for within Curry, if that makes sense. So we have a lot of teacher education classes. I'm thinking also of like school leadership classes, thinking about how can we create classes within those curricula to help facilitate those conversations amongst practitioners, and to build that into our training as people go into the field, become teachers in schools and leaders in schools. to make that happen more commonly.
And I'll throw out just a caution. One of the things that I think we've got to pay attention to is how can we share this information and what regulation is going into it. Right now with the reauthorization of the Higher Education Act, there's language in the current bills that people are looking at that will start restricting our ability to share this information across colleges and across schools. I think one of the great benefits of some of the work that was done in the previous reauthorization was allowing those things. So I think we have an opportunity to show that this sort of research, this sort of collaboration can be beneficial for students as well as for states. And we have an obligation to be aware of this sort of rulemaking so that we can influence whatever comes out of it.
Yeah, it really sounds like when we think about kind of how the evolution of this relationship is, or like where it's at right now, it's a lot about awareness building, right? I think specific projects to kind of build some muscle memory or some skills around it. We talk about kind of, how we make sure to incorporate the conversations that we're having with our external organizations, and then also embedding these into current leadership courses, that are orienting people that are coming out and leading organizations outside. So all of that, I think, that's kind of where the point of where we're at. And I guess as we think about it, as we continue to move past kind of the awareness phase and kind of more into the, where we're kind of walking this path together, and you touched on it a little bit, but are there some concerns that you guys have broadly? Obviously data security are some concerns, but maybe there are other things that we should be thinking about. Because as anything is always true, it's at the pace of these things. It's just sometimes it's hard to get ahead of. So maybe there's some things that we should be cognizant of. Do you guys have thoughts about that? Yeah.
Yeah, so I've spent a lot of time in terms of thinking about this too, because so I was at the Institute for Education Sciences talking about our crowdsourcing platform and saying, and we would need a staff to be able to sort of run this basically. Sort of crowdsourcing managers basically, and they said, oh, well, what's that? What is a crowdsourcing manager? What's a replication manager? And I said, I'm not quite sure. And what occurred to me is that, and Victoria's keynote really sort of spoke to me, is that, I think that as part of this, what we need, in some ways, it's a new field, a new discipline of researchers and practitioners who are sort of equipped to be able to handle sort of the technical sophistication, but also able to manage the security, the privacy, the IRB issues. And that is more than I think is in our sort of current portfolio on our jobs, but also I think requires sort of a new level of expertise to be able to, somebody who's a professional who's able to sort of balance these two things in concert with each other. I don't know if you guys have experience in this too.
Yeah, I am a very paranoid person by nature. And so I spent some time working with the Virginia Department of Education this summer. And I actually had a good chance to talk with one of the data security people there. I think it cannot be overstated how important it is for us to be really thoughtful about data privacy in this education context, not only because, data security in general is important, but because potentially we're talking about having a data set in which somebody from the moment of entrance into pre-K all the way through and past graduation from college, if that's the pathway that they choose, into the labor market, all of this information is being connected together. At the state level, we have the Virginia Longitudinal Data System, in which people can kind of connect data from health, from corrections, from education, and that's kind of being built out as we go. But they're being really thoughtful. I met the team who's working on that. They're being super thoughtful about how to deal with some of these issues, some of these concerns, and I think it would be to our detriment to not have that as part of every single conversation going forward, especially to Vivian's point, the people who are doing the research are not necessarily the same people who are most equipped to think about these privacy and ethical concerns. And I think especially, one of the reasons, I don't know how true this is, I haven't done a survey or anything. One of the reasons I got into education policy research is the thought of what percentage of education policy researchers have had experience in their classroom context. And so being a former teacher, I think a lot about sort of what are the concerns that a teacher would have hearing a study like this or seeing that research like this is happening. And so thinking about what are all the different concerns that can come up from different people and trying to figure out how can we represent those concerns thoughtfully as we think about privacy, security, and ethics.
And drilling down a little bit on something that Brian said, one of the concerns that I have as a researcher is particularly looking at something like predictive analytics and the influence that might potentially have on a student's progression through. If we're looking mainly at a majority of students, we may be missing student groups that behave differently. So if I say that I'm looking at the behavior of a student who comes to UVA versus a student who goes to Piedmont, Virginia, more than likely your student is going to be moving through very quickly, more than likely they're going to be driven, they're but if I use data that is looking at that student versus a student who's part-time, housing insecure, food insecure, first generation, all of those things that we know tend to be detrimental, I may be missing things that would actually be more supportive of a student who has many of those constraints. So as a researcher and as an administrator, I worry about those things going forward.
Yeah, in the education field in particular, I think everybody kind of harped on that. The data security issues are really critical. And I think at this stage as well, as we're working to build trust between what data science is, and it's not just this, it's not smoke and mirrors. It could have real significant impacts to move the field forward. That piece of it could be critical. Yeah.
Yeah, and another thought that occurred to me this morning we're in an interesting space when it comes to education data, because I think also a lot of the people who handle our data are not necessarily public organizations. So I'm thinking of things like the College Board, I'm thinking of things like the Common Application, I'm thinking of things like Power School, which is kind of like, they run the infrastructure of like attendance and grades for like many, I would say the vast majority of public schools out there. And so thinking about who has the data, who is currently in ownership of the data, I think that's a really big, interesting question to be thinking about, especially as we consider like, what do they then know about private individuals across the country, and what are they doing with that information, not with publicly funded researchers and so on. So it's just an interesting question to that end.
I will say that we became very concerned about that as well, and as part of our legal contracts, we've started including phrases and clauses that hopefully will protect the use of that student data going forward.
That's great. Okay, so we have 2 minutes left. So I'll open it up. We'll take one question for anybody that has. Yes, please.
I guess I'm curious as to what actionable items and concrete changes you guys have instituted based off of just the recent research that you guys have done.
Sure, yeah. You might be better.
No, you go ahead.
So there's a really, really big project that's happening within our research lab, Nudges to the Finish Line, in which they very much are using this exact sort of thought process of, how can we use predictive analytics to better support students? There's a lot of good evidence that students who are close to graduation may not finish for a lot of very specific actionable reasons. And so there's this project called Nudges to the Finish Line, in which they're trying to identify these students who are at risk of dropping out close to graduation, and figuring out sort of what are the things that they can do in quick, light touch sort of intervention that can be applied cheaply and easily to all students in this circumstance across many different colleges, many different states. What are the things in which we can do to kind of like connect with these students really quickly and provide them with the services that they need? And so there is a working paper out, I think, that just came out like a couple days ago, actually. Zach Mabel is, I think, one of the lead researchers on that. And they're finding some really interesting things, and I think that that's a really good example of, applying these techniques, these methods, these thought processes, and putting them into action in a way that's fairly quick on the turnaround.
The interesting part about that particular study is that we had expected the light touches to be more successful on the muddy middle, on the students who likely should be able to be successful, but for whatever reason are not. Not necessarily been the case. It's actually the higher risk. Those students who are at a higher risk for dropping out have actually been more influenced by these quick nudges, as well as the relationship with someone on the backside to be able to answer their text and do other things.
That's great, and that's really important work. So I think we're at time. That being said, if there are things that you've been thinking about that you didn't mention that you think we should know as we build this relationship between the broader field of data science and education, please feel free to come up or write it down on a piece of paper and share it with us. That's part of the orientation of this kind of conference today. We'd love to get your thoughts on that, so feel free to do that. I know Vivian has to run, but the rest of us will be available up here if you want to come up and chat. So thanks a lot for a panel.